Now I get to talk to you about BirdCut. This is a project we recently completed, but this project had been ongoing in the city of Punta Gorda for quite some time. I mean, 20 years they've been talking about doing something here. And this is just to orient you to the site. Here's downtown Punta Gorda. Here's Ponce de Leon Park, boat ramp, public park. This is the Punta Gorda Isles development here. This is Burnt Store Isles in the bottom right-hand corner. This is Alligator Creek that runs up and will actually jump underneath US 41 in this location. This canal system to the south is basically split by Aqua Esta Drive. There's no navigable access under Aqua Esta along here. So all of these canal system, all this waterway that's in here, which is the Punta Gorda Isles subdivision, they all have to go through Ponce de Leon Park at this location. And it's quite a boat ride, as I'll show you in a minute. These properties on the north side of Aqua Esta, they all have these different openings that go out in the Charlotte Harbor. So they all have navigable access, including this area. Some of these areas actually go underneath the bridge in some of those locations. This area of Punta Gorda on the bottom right-hand side was called the bird section because all the roads are named after birds. And they were interested in trying to create a secondary access channel. So the problem that we have here, as I pointed out, is that Punta Gorda Isles, it's a boating community, and their only access is right here through Ponce de Leon Inlet. And if you are this poor guy living way up inside of Punta Gorda Isles, this is the travel route that you have to take in your boat down the slow speed area out to the perimeter canal, all the way back up to the west and then to the north, and then out through Ponce Inlet. That's a 72-minute boat ride. And, you know, when you want to go boating, you really want to, unless you really like looking at your neighbors' houses and their boats, what you really want to do is get out on the water where you can see nature and go fishing and swimming and enjoy life. So there was a real problem. And so these people in this area, in this community, really wanted to be able to find an alternative route. Now, there was lots of advantages to that as well. You know, as this builds out, this waterway gets more and more cluttered with boat traffic. All we need is one person to sink their boat in the middle of that channel and nobody be able to get around, and boating is shut off for that community. So we were hired by the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance to do sort of a feasibility study. And there's a lot of factors that go into doing these kinds of projects. So you really need to understand everything that's going on. I looked at it and I could tell right off the bat that the best solution would be something that would take place down in this corner where it says project location and make a connection down in here. Because I already had Alligator Creek, which was a marked navigation channel being maintained by Charlotte County. It was the best solution to service all of the interior waterway here as well as some of these boaters up in this area. So we came up with a project site under that program, and we looked at it, and I said, look, this makes the most sense here. Even though I've got to impact mangroves, any other solution was going to have as much or close to the same amount of mangrove impact. But in this particular case, the property was privately owned. So I could make this cut through on land that was owned by a single individual, and I wouldn't be having to deal with like the Department of Environmental Protection or the trustees, which are also the landowners of all this land that's out in front, out here, and all the stuff that comes up to these mangroves is all state-owned land. I also had the advantage of what we call the Smuggler's Cut, which is this little channel that you see down through here. It comes back around and back into Alligator Creek. Because this is tidally connected into the canal system, I already had tidal exchange for this location. So I wasn't creating a situation where I would be exposing either Alligator Creek to pollutant runoffs from the canals here or vice versa, which is the case sometimes with the Caloosahatchee River. So I had flushing conditions in my favor. And because I had a marked navigation channel that was maintained by Charlotte County, I had that in my favor. I had some existing resource impacts already, but mostly I had a supportive community for this project. They were game and they were supportive of doing this. And Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance funded us to do this initial feasibility study. Now that was a project where we basically didn't break even. We ended up a little bit in the red on that. But you have to also make those determinations about, well, is it worth it? Is it worth doing this? So while we maybe didn't generate a profit and maybe we didn't make as much money on it, or actually in this particular case we lost money, it was the right project to do. It fit our expertise. It was something that I wanted to do. I felt strongly about having the secondary channel. It was a boating improvement. I'm a strong advocate for boating. So we went ahead and took it on, and we came up with a plan. Now, one of the things that we had to determine was who pays. And that was a really significant philosophical discussion with the city of Punta Gorda, because some of the people felt that the city should pay under ad valorem taxes, where everybody pays their taxes, their property taxes, and then the city pays for the work to be done. However, my experience has been that really what you want to do is you want to have the people that benefit from the work paying for the work. And so I came up with this outline of this area that I considered to be the benefit area. In other words, these are the people that directly benefit, and I picked La Casa Island Court right here as a separation point, because from this point, it was the same distance to go north to Ponce Inlet, or the same distance to go south to Alligator Creek. So in that particular case, they were on the neutral line, for lack of a better term. But everybody up inside here in this area, all of these properties and these canals, all would be benefiting from having a secondary access at this location. What was really rewarding about this for me was that once we finally got under contract with the city of Punta Gorda, who took the project on as the applicant, and we went from working for Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance, which was just a coalition of boating groups, to now working for a municipality, the city of Punta Gorda. They hired an economist whose economic specialty was special assessments. And they went through and evaluated the entirety of the site. They did the pros and the cons, and they came out the other side with essentially the same area that we had set up originally as who would be the benefiting party here. Now, what they did is they looked at these properties and they defined the properties by water access units. That means that if I have a single family home that it's got 85 feet or more shoreline under the city of Punta Gorda's development codes, I could put 2 boat slips in there. So that's 2 water access units. If I'm a multi-family condominium that's on the water, then I'm allowed to have boating access. How many slips I put in is really directly related to either the county's manatee protection plan, or it's related to how many linear feet of shoreline I can physically fit. And that comes back to what the land development code is for the city of Punta Gorda. So they came up with water access units, and they made the determination that it was going to cost you, if you owned a boat or had a boat slip, about $1,000 to pay for this particular project. And when I presented this project in a meeting, this was a workshop that the city of Punta Gorda put on. It was held at the Charlotte County Civic Center. It was the largest audience that I'd ever talked in front of. There was over 800 people in attendance. Fortunately, it was at the end of the day, and I was beat from everything else I was doing. So I went up there, and I wasn't nervous at all. I was just tired. And so that was probably a little bit to my advantage, because there was very little adrenaline left. And fortunately, I knew my business here. I knew what this was about, so I could talk about it, and I did for an hour. But you would be surprised how many people that live on waterfront property that own fancy boats would complain about $1,000 special assessment to improve their boating access. And now some people were all for it. They thought it was the best thing, and thank goodness the city's finally moving forward. Other people were complaining about it, and at one point it actually got down to a real decision, and that was where our elected officials, they're the ones that are on the hot seat. They're the ones that have to make that decision about whether they were going to do this project or not, and they elected to. But it wasn't as easy as that. Here was the original design that we came up with for the site. Okay, and so if you recall, we were coming down and we were going to dredge a canal through here. Now here, I already had open water body where it shows cross section AA. I already had some open water body there. And then I had mostly uplands in this location where section BB was. So I was really trying to minimize my mangrove impacts. And then I also proposed to put in a cantilevered wall so I wouldn't have to have any impacts to mangroves by using a dead man or an earth anchor system. Well, that didn't go over real well with the property owners that lived here. And then, of course, we also had the south side channel. I was going to confine all the activities to within the original dredge limits and widen it somewhat and take this dredge material and put it on this land so this property owner could gain from the fill on his property. And it also restored access to this canal, which had filled in. As you can see, this shallow water area here adjacent to this main drag or the main dredge channel in Alligator Creek fills in on a regular basis. So this was the plan that was the outcome of the work we did for the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance. And this was the plan that was presented in that workshop where I had the whole city council up on a big platform, and we had a speaker and a podium, a speaker's podium, and where I presented this project and talked about all the pros and the cons. And that's where people got up, and for the next hour and a half after my hour presentation, they talked about why they liked it and why they didn't like it. But I thought we had a pretty good plan, but then it was like, wait a second, not so fast. The city now is taking on what's pretty controversial because it's going to cost somebody money. It's either going to cost the whole city of Punta Gorda money through ad valorem taxation on property taxes, or it's going to cost those people as a benefiting properties under a special assessment. So the city wanted to make sure, absolutely make sure, that this was the right project, the right location. Now, one of the things you have to understand as an engineer is that we look at things in common sense, goes, well, yeah, of course that's the right location. Why wouldn't you put it there? But that's not what keeps elected officials elected. They have to be able to show that they have done their due diligence. So they approached us about doing the first phase, which was doing an assessment, an alternatives analysis. Let's investigate what other alternatives are out there before we simply agree to do the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance plan. So they started with a very detailed work scope where they wanted us to go out and dive the alignments and look for seagrasses, and I was able to talk them into doing things that were more of an order of magnitude. If we assumed a regular area of impact for each channel based on a 60-foot wide navigable bottom, and we put it through mangroves, we could calculate what that mangrove impact was. So we took a look at these locations, and we talked about the halfway point between Ponce Inlet and the alternative number 1 entrances, which is down here, okay? And the reason why we're looking at these halfway points is because that started driving who's benefiting and who's not benefiting when we put this stuff together. Here was an old barge channel that the DEP for years has been trying to restore. It's all filled in. We always, at this location, we had a very broad, shallow delta that we would have to dredge through. I know we had sparse seagrasses in these locations, so I had a lot of mangrove impacts and seagrass impacts. Same thing with alternative number 2. Coming down through an existing mosquito ditch, I had a very shallow, broad area that had sparse seagrasses, but I knew we were still going to have seagrass impacts. We also took a look at alternative number 3, which is Smuggler's Cut. Could we dredge something there and come out this location? This was a terrible location because it had all kinds of oysters right at the mouth. And then we looked at alternative 4, 5, and 6. And these were different alignments within that same area that I previously showed you that we would possibly build this particular channel. Now, obviously, 4, 5, and 6 were the preferred locations because it allowed for these people up in the heart of Punta Gorda Isles to get out to the water quickly. So we had to do this basically to satisfy the city of Punta Gorda, but I also knew, again, remember I was telling you, you want to build that library of information that you've done before. I also knew that in my federal permitting, I would have to go through an alternatives analysis. I would have to show to the Army Corps of Engineers that we looked at all the possibilities, and that's how we arrived at the one that we're submitting to them. Because once you go through that, you're not necessarily through the woods, because if you do arrive at your selected location, the next thing you have to know is that you can minimize your impacts. And you have to make that case that your project doesn't impact any more than absolutely necessary. And once you pass that second step, the third step is mitigation. If there's no way you can avoid resource impacts, then you have to mitigate for those impacts. So I knew that we would have to be doing this for the Corps of Engineers, and I convinced the city to do this on an order of magnitude assessment in terms of volumes and areas versus very detailed mapping, because that was going to be really cost expensive. And the other advantage of doing this is that those people that had their own reasons, for example, the barge canal alignment, which was alternative number one, which really wasn't solving the problem. If you're this guy in the middle of the property and you come all the way up to barge alternative number one and come out this way, well, it's not that much further to go on up and go out Ponce Inlet. But at least this process got those naysayers out of the way, the people that were ill-informed or uninformed, and got them basically out of the picture so we could do our job. So here's what we did, because nothing's ever easy, and particularly when you're dealing with government and 800 plus people that show up at a workshop, you got to make sure that you're getting your ducks in a row. And so in this particular case, we had 11 ducks that we lined up. We started with channel length. And so we assumed this channel length was a standard width, and we could then calculate what that channel would look like and how many turns that we would have in the thing based on the channel length. So we went from 10 was the shortest to 1 being the longest. And in this matrix, the higher number that you scored, the better the project was going to be. We then looked at excavation volumes. Okay, what were the volumes that we would, thumbnail approach, because I knew that the orders of magnitude would be significant, hundreds of cubic yards differences. And so in this particular case, 1 to 10 was based on the volume of removal. If there was a significant volume that had to be removed, that was a number 1. And then if it was very little volume, that was a number 10. Then we had areas of impact, which was what's impacted in terms of mangroves and seagrasses. We had travel distance to put in the mix. That's why I showed you before those points. In fact, I'll back up to that real quick. These little halfway points, these halfway points for Ponce Inlet and alternative 1 entrances, those went into that matrix as well, because it was determining what the value of this secondary channel access would be. We also had to take a look at what the vessel traffic impacts were to Alligator Creek. We had people that lived upstream in Burnt Store Isles that did not like this project because it was going to be more boats in their channel. And so you had to be sort of cognizant of that and respectful of it. That's the secret to doing a lot of these projects that involve the community, is being respectful of people. And even if a person comes to you with a harebrained scheme, or really ill-informed, or they're just plain crazy, and we got them, you have to be respectful. Respect what they're saying, because you know what? They may have a little tidbit of information in there that you can cull out of that conversation. Take the rest of that conversation and sweep it aside, but that little tidbit of information can make or break a project. So be respectful and listen. Navigational visibility, how many turns, what's going to be for our boaters going in and out? Sawfish habitat, that's a big one, because I got to get through my sawfish issues with National Marine Fisheries Service. Is my project going to have a big impact to habitat or minimal impact to habitat? Public interest. I'm doing a project that in some cases was in the aquatic preserve, depending on which alternative we saw, or in some cases it was adjacent to the aquatic preserve. So I had to demonstrate that my project was clearly in the public interest. The other thing that was a big one was ownership negotiations. If I'm doing a project where I'm going to be digging in this main channel through lands that are owned by the public and are managed by the governor cabinet sitting as the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, that's a heavy-duty negotiation at the state level with a bunch of elected officials. When I compare that with a single property owner that holds the property that I can negotiate with face-to-face, and we can trade back and forth, huge advantage, because I'm only dealing with one entity versus elected officials. So, and that comes down to those ownership negotiations. And then shared maintenance costs. Hey, if my channel is intersecting with Alligator Creek, well, where that intersection occurs all the way downstream is now a shared cost between all of the users. That's an advantage to Charlotte County, because now you've got the canal users within Punta Gorda Isles sharing that cost of maintenance of that channel in the long term. And then the other thing was longevity. How long can I expect it to last? You know, if I'm putting a channel out into the western side of Punta Gorda Isles, you know, I've got a channel that I'm trying to put out here or one that's down here. I'm in a very exposed location. What's my chance of the longevity of that channel staying open? How frequently will I have to maintain it or dredge it? That was another big issue. So I love this quote by Creighton Abrams. I'm sure we've all heard it before at one time or another. But this is the best way to do this, to break this down into components, because it let the city know that we were really thinking through on their behalf, and it allowed us to implement input from different individuals regarding these issues. And it had a material impact on the final design. So here's those components. I kind of segued the items on the left-hand side in here again. And we looked at these, and this is what I'm talking about, you know, areas of impact and the alternatives, okay? So in all of these channel lengths, and these particular longer channel lengths, we're actually taking a look at including Alligator Creek, because we were going to be dredging part of that as well until the county came back and got permits to widen it and deepen it. That changed this matrix significantly. But take a look at these excavation volumes. You know, the barge canal, 31,000. The Mosquito Ditch, 65,000. Smulders Cut, 52,000. When we get over to the original Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance plan, which was the Bird Cut East, 12,000 cubic yards. That's a significant reduction in the total volume that we would have to dig. Okay, same thing on areas of impact. You know, I've got multiple tenths. I've got 1.9, 4.4, 3.3. These are all areas of impact to resources, mangroves and seagrasses. You know, again, the Bird Cut one comes up at 0.3. Hey, again, we're looking pretty good. Same thing in travel distance for the boaters. What are we gaining for the boaters? In the particular case of the different locations, we ended up a little bit higher with the Bird Cut East because they were having to come around the corner and into the channel. What were our vessel traffic impacts to Alligator Creek? And again, you're seeing what these options were and how we were ranking those. And the increase, it's a significant increase, 158% increase. That's a lot of boats. Now, that also assumes everybody leaves at one time, and we know that on the average, not more than about 5% of any boating population is actually active in the waterway. Navigational visibility, here is our ranking in terms of right angle turns that we would have to get into the channel. Same thing with sawfish habitat. You know, in this particular case, you know, our impacts to sawfish habitat were relatively insignificant compared to some of the others. So we ranked really high, and in fact, with our project, which was kind of cool, we were able to take an upland area and excavate it down to create small 2 sawfish impacts. I'm sorry, small 2 sawfish habitat. So we actually get to create habitat versus impacting it, and that's always fun to do. Again, I already talked about the ownership negotiations dealing with the property owner. On these 3 locations, and I'll go back real quick for you. Again, we had the east side here, alternative 1, which is the work that we did for Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance. Then we had alternative 5, which was keeping everything on the private ownership area. And then we had alternative 4, which went through state-owned bottomlands, but utilized an existing Mosquito Ditch. So it wasn't really the best alternative, but as you can see, that ownership negotiations changed significantly. In all of these cases, up including alternative number 4, I would have had to be dancing with the trustees trying to get the state to approve us impacting public resources. In this particular case, I'm dealing with one property owner. You just can't go better than that. That's the simplest way to manage a project. And then I had to look at shared maintenance costs. Again, in this particular cases, in all 3 of these cases where we spill out into Alligator Creek, I've already got a county MSBU that's established. An MSBU stands for Multiple Services Benefit Unit, where they agree to tax themselves to maintain that waterway. And then, of course, I've got this longevity. What's my exposure? And then the projects that were out on the Charlotte Harbor didn't rank real high, but I've also got some alignment issues here with our channel because of the square cuts trying to minimize mangrove impacts. So bottom line was that we ended up with an alternative, which was alternative number B, which is actually the one we ended up with. We actually had to abandon the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance plan somewhat, and I'll explain those reasons for you. Here's what we ended up with. The original Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance plan was going to use, if you remember, it was going to use this open body of water here and come through this location. Well, a couple things come into play. Again, understanding the complexity of your project is really important. First off, I had these two property owners, Mr. Sussman and Mr. Markgraf, really didn't want to have a bunch of boats going past their house all the time. So that was one thing I was dealing with. The other thing I was dealing with is by shifting the project to the west, it took me out of having to deal with Charlotte County. So I had no permitting issues with Charlotte County. All of my permitting was strictly with the city of Punta Gorda at the local level. Now, I still had to get my state and federal permits, but at least I'd condensed my local permitting to just the city of Punta Gorda. Other things that occurred, if you notice, the entrance coming off the canal, see how curved this is? This is curved specifically to deal with eliminating 90-degree angles for the boaters. So as they're coming through here, they can see ahead of themselves a little bit better. The other thing we ended up doing, we ended up shifting the channel to the west. So we actually were going to have an impact to all these mangroves along this side. And the reason why we had to do that was because Mr. McQueen, who was the property owner here before we sold it to the city of Punta Gorda, also wanted to be able to develop this property and hold out some space for him to put his boat docks in. So that forced us to shift it to the west. So the last thing that we did, and this had to talk about the maintenance aspect of it. If you remember under the maintenance rankings, see how we didn't do so well with the 7s here? Well, that's because I've got this ebb-dominant Alligator Creek coming down here, and it's moving sediments all the time. When we first surveyed this, this whole section of this channel had been filled in. Now you can see it has been dredged. It was dredged subsequent to Charlotte County doing their dredging project in 2010. But then after that, it filled in. So we said, okay, let's do this. Let's widen the channel. Let's bring the channel down to the south side here, and let's create what's called a settling basin so that this can slowly fill in over time. And as it does, we just keep moving the channel markers, narrowing the channel until at some point we decide we need to do a maintenance dredging project. Then you're mobilizing to do a really decent volume of material, and it's cost effective. The other thing that was interesting, and we were trying to do things that were in the public interest. Now, we had to buy some mitigation credits from Little Pine Island Mitigation Bank for the mangrove, direct mangrove impacts here. And part of that is because mitigating for your impacts on sites expensive, particularly with the Army Corps of Engineers. But we also wanted to enhance this project. So we took this east side, which is all up, and that was all excavated down to create a mangrove shelf. And we proposed to excavate all of this area, including this piece, on state-owned bottomland. This was all filled from digging out this waterway. It was completely populated with Brazilian pepper, a monoculture that's not good. It's an invasive exotic. And we had offered to the DEP parks folks, as part of this project to meet our public interest test, we will go in and we'll excavate that down and restore it to mangrove habitat. We could not get the DEP to come to the table to agree to disagree on anything. So as a result, we ended up digging it out and leaving that there in place. So this is an aerial of what let me go back and show you that. In this particular case, we ended up going right to the property line, and we ended up digging out all of this material to create small tooth sawfish habitat. We created a wetland area along this edge and a wetland area along this edge. We had to get away from using the cantilevered seawall. Instead, we used an earth-anchored seawall where we went in below the mangroves with a helical system to catch our firmament, and then we have seawalls that were below the water line, and that we have pilings lined on the outside in order to keep boaters within the channel and off of the seawall. So finally we got going, got our permits in place, got a contractor that had his experience doing this kind of work, and we started the construction. It was sort of weird impacting that level of mangroves. But I thought that we were, in the big grand scheme of things, cost to benefit, it weighed much more heavily on the benefit side, considering that we were mitigating for our mangrove costs. Fortunately, the city was really active in their drone monitoring of our project, so we have some great drone footage. We also photo document our projects on a regular basis and send our reports to our clients. So here's the contractor staging inside the canal system. The idea was to do all the excavation from the land as much as possible before we actually had to get out into the water. In the background on this photo, you see Alligator Creek. Alligator Creek is part of the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserve, so that makes it an outstanding Florida water. The standard that you have to meet for water quality is much higher in that location than it is in these artificially created canals. So here we are getting rolling. I think the next photo I've got gives you an idea of where we've got most of the channel alignment cleared. If you notice, we've got this nice mangrove buffer on the left-hand side of the photo. Again, our original design was to go through this channel right here. It actually would have had less mangrove impacts, but these property owners were not keen on having that boating traffic going past. So what we've done is we've kept these mangroves in place. This area, which is the upland, is now excavated, and that's a mangrove planting area. So in time, that will be vegetated and will function as a screen or buffer for that particular property owner. So we had some, we had some issues. We had to get equipment off of this onto the site. We had to get vegetation and a surface layer of organics off. We also were dealing with an extreme high tide condition. This contractor was working in the water almost all the time. And keep in mind that our seawall panels, I don't think I put in here a drawing because I didn't want to make this too long for you, but the seawall panels, the top of the seawall panels stopped at the mean low water elevation. And the fendering and the earth anchor system was attached at the top. And the reason for that was to allow for flushing to exist with the remaining mangroves on site, so we wouldn't basically impact them. So this gives you an idea of the contractor underway. You can see the dragline mats they use to get their equipment on site. Over here, you can see the excavator installing vinyl sheet panels. They've got the turbidity curtains in place. That's our survey boat right there. We were contracted to take this through construction. One of the things that we were obliged to do is provide an environmental compliance officer. So we were on site monitoring for turbidity, as well as looking for manatees to make sure we didn't have any conflicts. That was part of our permitting construction. But the one thing you're going to find on all your construction projects is it's a messy business. So you have to anticipate you're going to have some real problems at some point or another, just like the folks downtown at Silver Hills and City Walk are having to deal with their turbidity issues with these rains that we've got. And how do you deal with turbidity? And now this is back at this location out here. You can see they've got some of their turbidity controls where it interfaces. This is where the canal opens up into Alligator Creek. And this is the turbidity curtains. They built a land bridge along the mangroves. This is where they're putting in their panels. We had 3 sets of turbidity curtains in place in order to hold the material. And even still, on occasion, you can take a look even in this picture. You can see there's a little bit of darkened water in the bottom right-hand corner. If that's above our 29 NTUs, then you've got a problem with compliance. And so we would have to go in and shut them down and wait for the turbidity to subside before they could get started again. What are these red lines are for? I apologize. That seems to be coming up on somewhere else. Anyways, mitigation sites. This is post-construction. This is our final project. I apologize. I'm not sure where the red lines are coming from unless I clicked on something and it's marking it up. But regardless, this is a view. This is looking north. This is our channel. You can see, oh, there we go. Oh, okay. These are the pilings that we put in along the entire length on both sides. And I'll explain to you the reason why, but let me start off first with what's going on here. Okay, this is the area that we cut through. We're now looking north versus this south view. Okay, that's looking south, and this is looking north. And so what we've got here is this is our small-tooth sawfish habitat area. that we've created. We excavated that to -2 feet mean low water, or -1 mean low water. That mimics small 2 sawfish habitat, which is Eurohaline water, mangroves adjacent, and it also is shallow water habitat, so that the juveniles are not predated upon by bull sharks, which is their primary threat. We have this riprap that we placed along this embankment. This was originally the upland, and we sloped that down. We took pilings and set the pilings at the bottom of the riprap to keep boaters off of it, and there's a sign right there that says, "Caution, submerged rock," because some people just don't get it. In the right-hand side, you can see the area that we excavated down to plant mangroves. We're having some issues with that because the contractor excavated it, we surveyed it and said that looks good, and then the contractor came back and modified it, and that was a problem. And so now we're dealing with that. But the other reason why we put these pilings in along here, and I've got a photo that's going to show this really well, was so that if we had 2 really large boats that would be passing, instead of them getting into the mangroves or getting on top of the sheet pile, which in most cases are submerged, they could simply lay up to the piling and stop and let the other boater come through. The design width of the channel is 60 feet, which is more than enough room for boaters to get through here, but not everybody is as skilled a boater as we would like to hope, so you have to keep that in mind. Here's a kind of a close-up of the small 2 sawfish habitat in the sign. We put pilings across the entrance here to keep motorized vessels out and give sawfish a chance to survive and establish it here. I don't know if we're going to get sawfish in there. We haven't set up any monitoring equipment to document that. And I may do that still. I may work with some folks to do that. But in this particular case, the riprap functions as a sill. We'll get mangrove volunteers that will float in and establish in that rock. In the background, you can see the mangrove shelf that we created that was planted, and that's doing okay. We have the interior area right here that's all down to that -1 foot mean low water. And actually, it runs back all the way to that west property line where the state wouldn't allow us to excavate or remove any of their exotics or upland. Really a missed chance and very much a disappointment from a state agency that's supposed to be in charge and creating habitat and managing habitat. It was really a lost opportunity because it wouldn't have cost them anything at all. So that kind of gives you a sense of what the sawfish habitat looked like. And here's a photo of the thing when it's done. Now you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the seawall panels where the vertical seawall panels go in, and then the earth anchors go back in underneath the mangroves. And that was a challenge for us because in the wet, we were trying to work with the contractor on figuring out how they were going to get the bearing capacity of those helicals. And the helical anchor, basically, if you buy a pop-up tent, sometimes from Northern or from some of the other suppliers like Home Depot, they'll give you a screw anchor, which is basically an anchor that you can screw into the bottom, then you can attach to it. Interesting red waves on the screen. Not sure where that's coming from either.
Maybe some attendant student put the annotation. No worry.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah. I don't mind. It doesn't bother me really that much. But I'm assuming you guys can see my arrows. You can see where we've got the submerged seawall. So that's actually 6 feet of water depth right there where that piling is. But if you notice, there's water behind it, and that water exchanges with these mangroves over here and exchanges with these mangroves over here. But if you take a look at the size of that boat going through, again, not everybody is a experienced boater. So someone that might be uncomfortable or unsure, this gives them the ability to simply tie up to that piling and let the other boater pass if they're coming in the opposite direction. So, and then if you also notice this curved approach, it's very gentle. It gives people the ability to see ahead of themselves of who's coming at them. So what were the lessons that we learned on this project?